All right, you guys wanted a deep dive on Montie Rissell, serial killer. Operated in Alexandria, Virginia, back in the 70s. And we've got, well, let's see, we've got his Wikipedia page, couple of news articles. Oh, and even some mentions in popular culture stuff.
Yeah,
This is one of those cases that, I don't know, it's just like sometimes real life, is just weirder and scarier than fiction.
definitely.
So Monty Ruff Rissell, for those who don't know, American serial killer and a rapist.
Right.
Between 76 and 77, he killed 5 people and raped 12, all women.
Yeah,
He's currently in prison, 5 consecutive life sentences. And instead of just going through his crimes like chronologically, one by one,
right.
maybe we should try and figure out like how he ended up going down this dark path.
Yeah, that's a really good place to start. I mean, understanding the psychology of a serial killer it's never easy, but sometimes, you can find some clues in their early life. And Rissell, well, he had a pretty turbulent childhood.
Yeah.
Abandoned by his father at 7, then his mother, she remarried and divorced like 2 more times before he was even 12.
Wow. I mean, that kind of instability, just wow, that can't be good for a kid.
No, absolutely not. And even more concerning is that, well, his criminal behavior, it started really young.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, he committed his first rape at 14, and then he was arrested for attempted robbery at 17. He even tried to, rob a woman in an elevator with a knife.
An elevator. I mean, come on. That takes some, I mean, that's brazen.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And, and he got a 5-year suspended sentence for that.
Oh, wow.
Basically, he was given a second chance.
Yeah.
But it seems like, it didn't really do much to deter him.
It makes you wonder, right? Like about how effective, traditional punishment really is for someone like Rissell. I mean, do you think there are any like missed opportunities, to intervene or like rehabilitate him?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, of course. But, I mean, these early offenses are, they're like huge red flags.
Yeah.
Maybe if there had been, a more intensive intervention back then, things might have been different.
Right.
But, I mean, we really don't know for sure. What we can do, though, is look at how these early experiences might have, played a part in his later crimes.
Okay, so we know he had this like really messed up upbringing and he had these run-ins with the law early on. But I mean, how did he go from that to like, being a serial killer? Where's the turning point?
Well, his first murder, I mean, that's pretty telling. Or Marina Gabor, that was back in August of 76.
Right.
She was a sex worker, lived in Rissell's apartment complex.
Okay.
And he claimed that he drowned her in a ravine after they had sex because he was angry, because she seemed to be enjoying it.
I mean, that's chilling that he would kill her because she seemed to be enjoying it.
Yeah, it suggests a really distorted sense of reality.
Oh, yeah.
It shows like this dangerous combination of narcissism and lack of empathy.
Yeah.
Like he couldn't handle the fact that, someone else could have like genuine feelings
Right.
or desires
Right.
that were separate from his own.
And that she was like she challenged his control by enjoying it. So he had to like reassert his dominance.
Yeah, exactly. And this need for control, it becomes like a recurring thing in his crimes.
Right.
I mean, his later murders, they get more frequent and more violent.
So then, you have his second victim, Ursula Miltenberger. She was only 22, a manager trainee at McDonald's, and he raped and stabbed her near the Hamlet apartments.
Right.
They found her body in a wooded area in Fairfax.
Yeah. And unlike Gabor, who, lived in his building, Miltenberger was a stranger to him.
Right.
So he was like expanding his hunting grounds.
Yeah, yeah. So not only was he escalating the violence, but his choice of victim is broadening.
Exactly. He's getting bolder, more confident, and he's losing any sense of, morality or consequence.
Right. And it's going to get even worse, isn't it? Because his next 3 victims, they all lived at the Hamlet apartments. It's like he just decided to like terrorize his own neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's so chilling about it. It's like he felt untouchable, like he could do whatever he wanted.
Right.
And the details of these crimes, I mean, they're truly awful.
Let's talk about Gladys Ross Bradley. She was what, 27, worked at the post office.
right?
Rissell, he waited outside her house. He had a steak knife from his mother's kitchen, raped her twice, and then dragged her to a creek.
Yeah, and the premeditation, it's chilling.
Yeah.
He's not impulsive anymore. He's planning his attacks. He's choosing his targets. He's getting weapons. I mean, it's scary.
Then there's Elitha Bird, 34 years old, a seamstress.
Yeah.
And he abducts her from the parking lot of a department store at Tyson's Corner Center.
Right. And the bird abduction, that shows another, shift in his way of operating. I
Yeah.
mean, now he's going outside of his immediate area. He's actively looking for victims
Yeah.
in broad daylight.
Yeah, it's like he was just losing any inhibitions he had left.
Yeah, exactly.
And his last murder,
Right.
the one that finally got him caught, that's probably the most brutal one.
Yeah, Jeanette McClellan. She was 24, worked as a proofreader,
Right.
also lived at the Hamlet Apartments,
Right.
and she was found, well, she had been raped and stabbed like 100 times.
100 times.
Yeah, in a culvert near Shirley Highway.
That's pure rage, pure brutality. It's like he was completely consumed by this need to inflict pain.
Yeah, I mean the intensity of that attack, combined with this pattern of escalation that we've been talking about.
Right.
It's see as like a deep psychological disturbance.
Yeah.
It's possible that killing, like that the act of killing itself, became like a source of pleasure for him.
As horrible as that sounds, it makes sense.
Right.
Given what we know about his crimes. But thankfully, I mean, his reign of terror did come to an end after McClellan's murder. So how did they catch him?
Well, the police had him under surveillance. They thought he was a suspect in these crimes. And they searched his car, and they found Bird's wallet and her keys and a comb. And his fingerprints were on Milton Berger's car.
Right.
So, I mean, they had him. He confessed to all 5 murders.
It's almost ironic, like he's getting so bold, so careless, and then he gets caught because he left evidence in his car.
It just goes to show, even the smartest criminals, they make mistakes.
Yeah.
And in this case, those mistakes, I mean, they cost him his freedom. But that's not the end of the story.
Right.
His case, it brings up a lot of like really fascinating questions about criminal psychology, about early intervention, and just about the complexities of justice.
Yeah. And we're going to dive into those questions in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll talk about what happened after his arrest, the public reaction, and what we can learn from this truly disturbing case. Okay, so we left off talking about Rissell's arrest, and you mentioned that there are some questions, lingering questions, I guess, about his psychology. What else can we learn from his case?
Well, the confession, it wasn't really the end of the story. It actually opened up another way to look into his mind.
Okay.
Rissell wrote this manuscript in prison, a handwritten manuscript, like 461 pages, all about his murders.
461 pages, handwritten. I mean, that's a lot of detail. It's kind of fascinating, right? But also really disturbing. What was he trying to do by writing all that down?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to know for sure, but some experts think, it was his way of kind of like reliving his crimes, reliving that power and control.
Right.
I mean, he was only 18 when they arrested him, so maybe the manuscript was like a way to hold on to some of that dominance that he lost.
So he was basically creating like a trophy of his crimes.
Yeah, something like that. A really mammoth up testament to what he did.
Did the manuscript, did it reveal anything new about his motives or his mental state?
It kind of reinforced what we already knew. I mean, the manuscript, there's no remorse in it, no empathy for his victims. He describes everything in this like really detached way.
Wow.
Almost clinical, like he's describing a grocery list, not the murders of 5 women.
It's that lack of remorse that's just, I don't know, it's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is.
It's like he was totally disconnected from what he actually did, from the human cost.
Yeah, and that's, one of the defining characteristics of psychopathy.
Okay.
People with that disorder, they often just, they lack empathy, they lack guilt. I mean, they can understand those concepts, like intellectually, but they don't actually feel them.
So are we saying that Rissell was definitely a psychopath?
Well, I'm not qualified to give an official diagnosis,
Right.
but I mean, just based on what we know, the lack of remorse, the manipulative behavior, the planning, it seems like yes, psychopathy is a real possibility.
And that kind of brings up some interesting legal questions, right? I mean, did he really understand like the consequences of what he was doing? Was he even capable of like making rational choices?
Yeah, those are questions that the legal system they struggle with all the time.
Yeah.
At what point does, a mental illness or a personality disorder, I mean, when do those things mean that someone isn't responsible for their crimes? It's complicated. There's no easy answers.
And it gets even more complicated because, he was so young when he did these things, barely an adult. So does age play a role in how we understand like criminal intent?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the brains as young adults, they're still developing,
Yeah.
especially the parts that are involved in impulse control and decision making. I mean, I'm not trying to excuse what he did, but it does make the whole issue of, is he really to blame? It makes it a lot more complicated.
So it's like this dilemma. On one hand, you have someone who did these horrible things. On the other hand, he's a young man whose brain, was still developing, and that could have affected his judgment.
Right. And it really shows the limitations of the justice system when it comes to, dealing with criminal behavior, especially when you're talking about young offenders and mental illness.
So what happened to him after they arrested him and convicted him?
Well, he got 5 life sentences consecutive when he was 18. But, the law in Virginia back then, it allowed for parole after 15 years.
Wait, so there's a chance that he could get out.
Well, yeah, that was the law. And in 1995, he became eligible.
And what happened?
It was a huge outcry. People were scared. I mean, the victims' families, the community, they didn't want him to get out.
I mean, can you imagine thinking that the person who killed your loved one could be walking the streets again?
It's terrifying.
Yeah. So did he get parole?
No, no, they denied it at his first hearing, and they've denied it every year since.
Wow.
People hadn't forgotten what he did.
So even though he's locked up, Rissell's story, it's not over, is it? He's popped up in pop culture.
Yeah, the Netflix show Mindhunter.
Right.
They had him in season 1. Sam Strike played him,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and they talk about the early days of criminal profiling.
It's interesting because true crime, it's so popular, but it brings up some tricky ethical questions.
Yeah.
Is it okay to like make money off of these stories? Are we exploiting the victims by turning their suffering into entertainment?
Yeah, those are really important questions.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this line, right, between, learning about these cases for education and sensationalizing them just to make money.
Right.
You have to be careful to remember the victims and their families and not contribute to this culture that glorifies violence or makes light of suffering.
So what's the takeaway here? What can we learn from Montie Rissell?
I think his case, it reminds us that even in the most normal looking places, there can be, real darkness. It shows how important it is to intervene early and how complicated it is to deal with criminal behavior, especially when mental illness is involved and when you're dealing with young people.
Yeah. It's a tough thing to think about, but it's important to remember.
It is.
We can't just, ignore these things. We have to learn from them, to understand why these horrible things happen and to try and stop them from happening again. And we can't forget the victims.
Absolutely. Their stories are really the heart of this whole thing. We need to remember them and work to create a world where these tragedies don't happen as often.
And their families, how do they deal with the trauma, the loss?
Yeah. That's what we're going to talk about in the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at how Rissell's crimes affected the Alexandria community and the things that are being done to help the victims' families and to make sure that justice is served.
We've spent a lot of time, trying to understand Montie Rissell's crimes and what might have caused him to do those horrible things. But what about everyone else? Like the community, the victims' families. How do you even start to heal from something like that?
Yeah, that's a really important part of this whole thing that sometimes gets forgotten. Rissell's crimes, I mean, they didn't just affect the women he killed, right? It dramatized the whole community. I mean, Alexandria was living in fear for months.
You mentioned before that there was a lot of like media coverage at the time. Do you think that that made things worse? Like the anxiety and stuff.
Oh, for sure. The media, I mean, they always play a big role in these kinds of stories. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. You know what I mean? I mean, in this case, it kept the pressure on the police to catch him, but it also made people more afraid, more uncertain.
It's like that thing with true crime, right? People people want to know what happened, but sometimes the details are so awful that it creates this feeling of panic.
Exactly. And with Rissell, I mean, the details were really bad. So yeah, the media coverage, it was important, but it probably made the trauma worse for everyone in the community.
So how did they cope, the people in Alexandria? How did they start to feel safe again?
It's a long process, and it's different for everyone. But one thing that often helps is coming together, as a community, supporting each other, sharing the grief, the fear.
Right, there's strength in numbers. Did Alexandria have like any resources or support systems for the families?
Yeah, yeah. Victim advocacy groups, they were really important. They provided counseling and legal help and just emotional support for the families and the police. They worked closely with the community, to address people's concerns and to make things safer.
That's good to hear that people came together to help each other. But even with support, trauma like that, it leaves a mark. How do the families, like, how do they deal with that in the long run?
That's a tough question. There's no easy answer. Everyone heals differently. And for some people, it's a lifelong process. Some people find comfort in therapy or in their faith. And some people, they find it in fighting for change.
You mentioned fighting for change. What kind of changes have the families been pushing for?
A lot of them have become, really vocal about changing the laws, about parole for violent offenders, especially those who commit crimes when they're young. They say that 15 years, it's not enough for taking a life, especially because of the pain that it causes to the families, the pain that never really goes away.
That's a good point. Getting a conviction, that's not the end of it. The families, they're still fighting for justice, even after all these years.
Exactly. And people are listening. The fact that Rissell is still in prison, that's because of them, because they never gave up. They never let people forget what he did.
It's a victory, but it's a sad one, because nothing can bring back their loved ones.
You're right. There's no happy ending here. But there is some peace in knowing that what they did, what they fought for, it made a difference. Rissell's in prison, and maybe they've helped to prevent other tragedies by pushing for tougher laws.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this really disturbing case, what's the one thing you want our listener to think about?
I think it's this. Even when we're faced with something truly evil, there's still hope. People are strong. We can find strength in each other, in fighting for what's right, and in grieving together.
That's a really powerful message. And it reminds us that even though we've been, exploring this dark part of human nature, there's still good in the world. The families of the victims, their strength, and their fight for justice. That gives me hope. Thank you so much for taking us through this case. It's been a journey into the darkest parts of the human mind, but it's also been a reminder that people are resilient and that the human spirit is incredibly strong.